Chandran, Nair, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It's been long in the making, and we're delighted to have you with us. For those of our audience who may, and I say may because you're world renowned, not be familiar with you, I'd like to briefly go through your impeccable bio. Chandran Nair is a founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, an independent Pan-Asian think tank based in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur. The Institute is focused on advancing a deeper understanding of global issues, including the shifts of economic and political influence from the West to Asia, and the dynamic relationship between business, society, and the reshaping of the roles of global capitalism. Chandran is a prolific author, and his latest book, Understanding China, Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence, will be published later this year. And his past and former three books are a must-read: Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World, and The Sustainable State, The Future of Government, Economy, and Society, and the Consumptionomics, Asia's Role. I always have a difficulty pronouncing it because you've made magic there as a wordsmith. Asia's Role in Reshaping Capitalism and Saving the Planet. He's also the creator of The Other 100, a nonprofit global photojournalism initiative to present a counterpoint to media consensus on some of today's most important issues. Chandran is as well a member of the Club of Rome, member of Global Advisory Board of Ethical Markets. And if I want to go through his full bio, we need a separate session. So I stop there and I jump into it. So Chandran, welcome to BRI Dialogues. You're on mute.
Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Ali and Professor Anush. It's a great privilege to be here, and I like the exaggeration on my resume, but I'll bank it for now. Thank you.
Chandran, when President Trump uses this phrase, you don't have the cards, you don't have the cards, irrespective of whom he's talking with, whether it's President Zelensky, whether it's, heads of other states, what are the cards that, both parties have and hold between China and United States? And where is this card gaming and playing heading to? And what are the aces that China may be presenting and putting on the table in the coming months?
Thank you, Ali. Just before I start, answering that question, and even that question, I'll try and answer it in a way that does not get us into the zero-sum game of the Americans and the current Trump administration. Let me just say that, for your audience, my take on China is based not as a learned academic or someone who has just recently come to China, as many people, commentators have these days, post the Trump first during the Trump first administration, or even just in the last 15 years, where the China threat became something that Americans were freaking out about, as were Europeans. So my take on China goes back a long way. I've had the privilege of being engaged in China for about 35 years. And so I like to think, being non-Chinese, I'm not from Xinjiang, as some might think, I would want to assume, brown skin and all, that I come from it from a very objective view. Objective view of someone who's looked at development, not from an academic sense, from a lived experience, but as a practitioner from my 5 years in Africa, etc., and my commitment to trying to look at these issues from a different lens. So I wanted to lay that out so that my sharing is based on a keen observation away from all that academic theorizing and the armchair sort of global geopolitical commentators. So I'll just finish that off by saying I first arrived in China in the early part of 1990 and saw a country. I went to Beijing, I stayed at a hotel in Tiananmen Square called the Beijing Hotel. And there was only one hotel around that. And you didn't get a key to your own room. Someone else kept the key. And there was no central heating. And most of the people were traveling in bicycles and mouse suits. And then I look at China today, and I think, having been to almost most parts of the world, I would define it as a miracle. What's happened in the space of about 35 years, at least that's what I saw. Being based out of Hong Kong, have traveled hundreds of times to China, I think. I've observed all those different stages of the transformation, and it is a social miracle. So to come to your point about the cards, who has, but let's remember that a card game requires two willing participants in this card game, and in this card game. There's only one entity that said, let's have a card game, and the card game is going to end up in a zero-sum game. And I win and you must lose. And I think the Chinese, anyone who understands China understands that China doesn't play these games. It doesn't see it and its interaction with others as a zero-sum game. And this is not to say that the Chinese don't have their own self-interests, that they don't have, different differences with countries in the region and elsewhere, but they don't see the geopolitical game being played this way. So when the current administration talks about we have the cards in our hand, I think the Chinese response is, well, we are not playing the same game. But if you do seek to harm us, then we will do what is needed to protect us. And I think to try and wrap up very quickly that discussion, you will know when the Americans threw, I think, 150% tariffs on the Chinese. And remember, this is the second Trump administration. The first Trump administration tried all of that, tried certain parts of, imposing sanctions and various things on China. China was much stronger. China is now weaker in terms of the economic growth, etc., but it's much more resilient, and we can talk about that. So when they threw that on China, I think they thought, like all most of the other countries, much weaker, much smaller, and much more subservient, would sort of negotiate. As you know, China said, "Okay, you 150, I got 152."
Mm.
And that's how they responded it. But the last point I tried to make on this is that when the Trump administration in 2018, the first time the Americans started playing the card game and thinking we could hurt you, the Chinese exports to the US were about 20%
Yeah.
of their total. In 2023, it was down to 12%. And I think in 2025 and 26, I haven't got the latest data, it might be down to single digits. So they're both sides, depending again on your ideological biases. Listeners can go and Google. We'll see all kinds of different, decks of cards being played out. Who's got the best cards? But I think we should be talking about really the Chinese resilience and how China has responded
Mm.
and how it has changed the Chinese view on its own economy, energy, food security, and all of that, and its relationship with the rest of the world. And like it or not, the opportunities it has created for China to engage with a world that has essentially been awakened to
Mm.
the sort of, irresponsible, unpredictable nature of the U.S. Government.
Uh, Chandran, I was in fact going to press you on the global implications of this tussle that Trump has now initiated with China, and I'm glad you've touched on that, um, because the contrast between the Chinese leadership's commentary about stability and security, global security and stability, and Trump's anarchy could not be more clear.
Yeah.
And when you hear what President Xi Jinping talks about, his priorities, are a whole spectrum of issues, including the environment, for example. And then when you then hear President Donald Trump speak, the rest of the world, as you suggest, is now becoming very aware of this disparity. I mean, we've been talking about shift eastwards for a very long time, but this is qualitatively different, Chandran. We are now looking at China providing a kind of a, a, I would like to call it more moral leadership, but diplomatic leadership for a post-American order in which priorities will have to change dramatically. And Europe seems to be caught up in that. Could you tell us a bit about what's happening in China's own hinterland in that regard, and whether you have any views on how China may see European transition in a post-Trump world?
Thank you. We could take 45 minutes to try and answer that because it's a very, very important question and it's the core, in my view, of everything is happening, particularly in relation to Europe as well. But very simply put, I think the Americans I mean, I was in Singapore earlier this week and lots of us were discussing different things. And it's amazing how many Asians and Europeans, the Europeans more quietly because somehow there's some sort of a heavy sort of burden on their heavy weight they carry about in any way dismissing the Americans openly, but have come to the conclusion that the Americans have shot themselves in the foot. People like me, I'm from Asia, Southeast Asia. I was born in Malaysia. My formative political views were shaped by the Vietnam War. And I always saw the American desire and need to use force uh, indiscriminately, napalm, bombs, Laos, etc., as something that for me as a young person at that time suggested there was something wrong with the nature of international relations and the body politics of the United States. Today, I realize it's U.S. exceptionalism. Some might call it white supremacy that discards the lives of others. So Donald Trump has done us all a great service, in my view. He has essentially said we're Americans, we're supremacists, and no one should challenge that. And then, as you said, in contrast, the world looks at the other leaders, but in this instance, the Chinese president, who doesn't espouse all of this sort of nonsense, even in Chinese. This is something you need to understand. Because Donald Trump speaks in the language of the global mass media, etc., which is English, and it gets channeled into all our rooms, etc. The kind of tyranny of English sort of problem. The Chinese president doesn't speak in English, but even internally would never utter these words because it's not in their way of behaving and showing leadership. So it shows the decay in the sort of American body politics. And he's not the only one. You can see the vice president, the foreign secretary, etc. So the rest of the world's looking at this and saying, hey, here is someone else. And now China is respected because of through its achievements, not military might sanctioning others, just its achievements. And people are saying, there is a different form of leadership. This man is speaking about a global governance initiative, which some of you may have heard of. He's talked about a shared humanity, etc. He has had this vision of the One Belt, One Road, development as peace, and all of those things. They senses this, and some of us are feeling it. If you go to Laos, you go to Vietnam, etc. So I think that is clear in the rest of the world. China is not perfect. There are things that we need to talk about in terms of, disputes, etc. But it's not an imperial power seeking to dominate and punish, etc. And the rest of the world is looking. Well, the rest of the world understands that big powers will exert some of their influence in ways that they may not like it. I come from Southeast Asia. There are issues with the South China Sea, etc. But China is not going and taking over stretches of the Philippines, Indonesia, or my own country because they have the might. So the rest of the world is very keen to engage. And to your point about Europe, and I think this is where Europe is lost. It doesn't know where to go. I don't know if you've all seen, but if I was English, I'd be very depressed. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but the UK Prime Minister yesterday was at a press conference with Donald Trump, and the question of Gaza was raised, and he said something to the effect that we can never ever have peace or a two-state solution with Hamas involved. Donald Trump stood hovering over him and then patted on him on his back and said, "Good, very good," almost dictating to him. "You said what I told you to say, didn't you, boy?" And so I think Europe is in a very difficult state. And 3 years ago, just to finish this off, I think Europe needs to decide that it should not continue to harbor this romantic view of a special transatlantic alliance with America. For the rest of the world, to put it crudely, it seems as, and I've said this several times, it slightly makes me a bit notorious. The rest of the world looks at it and says, white settler communities all getting together, hanging on, and Europe essentially being the mothership of the 500 years of colonization, saying, we don't have the power now, but our little brother that we gave birth to, called the United States, is now almighty. And if they can just continue the hegemony, we will hang on to that for another 100 years. But Europe needs to decide that the world and realize the world has changed. And I've said decouple from the United States, at least on foreign policy, have its own foreign policy. It's a long history and many things that many of us around the world look upon and respect, and form its own foreign policy that allows it to essentially, mend fences with China, other parts of the world, and very importantly, reframe its foreign policy in the Middle East away from the United States. So I think Europe needs leadership, and that's what's lacking. And until there's better leadership in Europe, and then nothing changes. And I don't see better leadership coming out of the United States for a long time, given they are on this sort of deep decline in terms of the body politics, which seems to be very corrupt and, in a way, steeped in immorality and exceptionalism.
Chandran, thank you for that. Yesterday, and the press conference that you were talking about was coincided with something very important. I wrote a piece on my Substack on Futurely. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia came out and talked about a defense pact, a comprehensive defense pact. And I titled it as a dysfunctional security umbrella and the dash for a security raincoat. So, so my question to you in that context is a bit broader to the East and the relationship between India and China, which is monumental on the sidelines of SCO, the Global Governance Initiative. Where do you see this dynamic going? Are these two having a dance of just convenience and when India shift again, or this time this is real, not just because of the tariffs that Donald Trump applied to India, but is there a bigger undercurrent where you are sitting? And in that context, are we seeing the manifestation of something that I've frequently talked about, a détente, a rapprochement, a collaboration between Russia, China, and India? And what would be the ramifications of that for the Heartland and the West Asia at large?
Ali, when you refer to the heartland, what do you mean?
The Heartland, I mean the Mackinder, right? But in a way, in more way than one, I think West Asia and subcontinent and China and Russia are the key real
Yeah,
estate anchors
yeah.
in that heartland. Because as you rightly said, Europe is in many ways, lost at the moment. So
No, very important point. I have for many years said that it's a shame that China and India were not, collaborating, coming together in the way we would want. But I've also said, and I've written about this, that there's an exaggeration in the West that China and India are at loggerheads and are someday going to clash. I don't think this, I said this will never happen because both countries have a wisdom, not just within the political elites, but across the nations that will prevent this. And as Pankaj Mishra, who came on my the virtual conference last week, when we talked about China and the world, said the relationship between China and India, as we all know, is very, very old. And the tensions over the last 50 years, I know more so in the last 25 years, is a period of time that is a blink in the sort of longer a blink of an eye in terms of the longer relationship. And so they're both very intertwined. So I've never felt that China and India would get into a state where that be, a real separation of sorts. And so I've also argued that China should be the one that actually supports the entry of India into the UN Security Council. And I've had some discussions with diplomats on both sides, etc. But there are lots of complications with this. But to answer your question, my view has been, and I was in India in February, where I had discussion, a very good, nice dialogue with the very articulate Shashi Tharoor, and I said that I thought that the relationship between China and India would be the most consequential for the 21st century. That it would essentially enable these two countries not only, and the inconvenient truth is India does need China from supply chains and all of that. And I think Indian industrialists and etc. know that. But India has also a lot to offer China, as we know. And so it would be consequential in that it would help two of the largest countries in terms of populations to economically and socially, develop. But very importantly, I also mentioned that it would have a dramatic impact on the subcontinent, particularly Pakistan and Bangladesh. Imagine an economic force that combines India's rising powers and know-how and China's supply chain and resources and all of that, that the implications for those two countries, very important countries, by the way, which many people don't fully appreciate, in my view, and essential for creating peace. And if you want to use that word, security for India, as you both know, Pakistan is a large country, and its population is expected to exceed 350 million or so by the year 2060. You can't have a Pakistan that is in the state it is today, and lots happening. And China, to finish off this is and again, in one of our virtual conferences, Ali, on the role of China in the One Belt, One Road, we had a very distinguished Pakistani who is very much involved in the One Belt, One Road uh, program talk about the impacts that the One Belt, One Road has had on China, particularly transport, education, etc. That has created tensions in India about what are the Chinese doing in Pakistan. But if China and India cooperated, that tension goes away.
Right.
And then it automatically brings Pakistan into that heartland of development. And let's not forget Bangladesh. And if you put those four countries together, you've got 4 billion people roughly 40%, 60 over percent of the world's population. You've got at least 50% of the world's population. And that is what development is all about. That changes all the dynamics in the world. So I think India and China are serious. And I see it'll be a slow process, so don't expect something to transform tomorrow. But Indians have now come to the conclusion that the Americans can't be trusted. But India is not going to cut its ties with the US, and it should not, and neither do the Chinese want to. But I think the Indians, as proud as they are, you just need to turn on Indian TV on any evening when Trump has said something insulting about India, and there's like 10 screaming voices on the on the Indian TV. The Indians are very proud. And when a couple of the American administration people insulted India and even had to go at Indian Hinduism and its customs, I think Indians don't forget. But it should not be about not forgetting the petty insults of politicians, but in analyzing the larger picture of what is going on and seeing that. And I would just say again here, I think Indians just need to get over this idea that they can be that China is better and has advanced,
Mm.
and therefore we do not want to cooperate with them. And Uncle Sam has said we are on your side, and get over that and understand that Uncle Sam can't do what China and India can do together to help the whole region, and in fact change Asia and the world.
Mm. Uh, I I really want to carry on conversation regarding Asia major powers, but before I do that, Chandra, I want to come back to it. Actually, not for Ali, but I want you articulate the position about the China's socioeconomic miracle, which has been extraordinary, unprecedented historically, really. But we all know that it's come at a price in terms of environmental vandalism that the Chinese themselves have now woken up to. They realize the damage of rapid Western style industrialization can cause and are rightly shifting gears faster than any country on the planet to use clean energy. And yet, the West continues to be obsessed with the idea that China is dependent on West Asian oil and gas. Knowing China as you do, how obsessed is China with Persian Gulf oil and gas for its prosperity, security, and economic development? Or have they worked out a formula that doesn't rely entirely on the continuous importation of that kind of, um, fossil fuels from the Persian Gulf?
Thank you, thank you. Let me just say, Professor, that environmental vandalism is at the center of the need for human beings to develop. The United States, American vandalism development included the largest extinction in terms of development, the
Yeah,
carrier pigeon, the bison, etc. And all human history has been part of that. We followed a model of economic growth that essentially externalized all costs and didn't internalize it, and we encouraged consumption relentlessly. So China, when it started redoing this, and this is where I was when I said I was arrived in Beijing in 1990. I mean, the country was polluted would be an understatement. The poverty was extensive. And that economic miracle that I talked to you about includes the cleanup in the last 15 years, especially since the Beijing Olympics, when China was insulted and even boycotts were being organized based on air pollution. Today, you can go to Beijing
yeah,
and the air is, you've also, you know what I mean. And I just give an example. When I went to Beijing, there was a river that goes through part of Beijing that was so polluted. Last year, when I went there, this is now 25 years, there were people swimming in it. So, and that's the ability of the state to essentially bring about change on a large scale method that most countries can't do.
yeah,
To be able to tell, scores of steel mills and industrial plants, you will move and you will do it in 2 years. And here's where you're going. I don't think there's another country in the world that can do
yeah,
that. So to your question now about, you know, the energy issue. The interesting thing that most people don't realize is that, in terms of energy consumption, coal is about 55%, right? No imports.
mm,
So it's got its coal. Some is dirtier coal, etc. So it does import some stuff from the rest of the world, including Australia. Oil and gas is about 21%,
yeah,
right? 21%, imports mostly.
right,
And then you have non-fossil, which is about 20%, all domestic. That's hydro, that's wind, that's nuclear. China has the largest number of energy nuclear plants in the world. So in a way, there's overcapacity if you put them all together. And there has been criticism of China, as you know, with regard to its strategy of 2060 net zero carbon and 2030, which is peak emissions of carbon, which many of the experts will tell you they have almost reached
Right.
or will reach in a couple of years. So when you look at all of that, what is clear, and that's been analysis done by external experts, energy self-sufficiency rate in China is about 85%.
Mm.
So of course, China will be worried about that the oil and gas imports that it still relies on, but it can essentially shift very quickly because it has 85% energy self-sufficiency. It has also surplus coal-fired. Now, one of the criticisms is building coal, but if you look at it, and this is my hypothesis as well, it is because if push come to shove, we will burn the coal.
Mm.
And why are we building more nuclear? So that we can be more nuclear self-sufficient. And I've spoken to some of the, most qualified a few nuclear scientists, etc., on nuclear energy, and they say that, of course, in Europe, I remember doing a workshop with some Germans about 2 months ago, and the moment I mentioned nuclear energy, they all went ballistic because you can't talk nuclear. It's like talking about communism, and or socialism. The Chinese people in the room said, I can't remember the exact numbers, but there's over 100 nuclear plants in China, and they're all fourth generation.
Mm.
And of course, we all hope, but there's not been a single accident as well. So they're building the capacity. Of course, the Chinese are very sensitive to, anything that will require them to burn more dirty coal.
Right.
But in terms of efficiency, in self-sufficiency, I think they can go. And the other point I would like to mention is this question about resilience. Um, the Chinese can tighten their belts, and I joke and say, if there was a few food issue for a few months, the Chinese can say to all the Chinese brothers and sisters, in the spirit of the revolution, can we all just reduce our consumption of rice by one bowl? And the Chinese all say, yep, we'll sign up, we'll tighten our belts, and there will be methods to incentivize people to just be resilient. Because pain and suffering and deprivation was not long ago. And
Mm.
it's the same with Indians. As you know, Indians are very resilient. That doesn't mean they should remain poor. And I think that's where the Chinese have shifted. They were very poor. They have what they do. And there, of course, there's indulgences as the economy has gone up. But essentially, the spirit is of resilience. You can't say the same about the Americans. So I hope I've answered your question that the energy self-sufficiency rate is pretty high, and they would not want to see oil supplies diminish. I can assure you there's thousands of energy strategists in China working relentlessly, all the various permutations. And that's why the coal, the nuclear mix, and all of that is part of this overall security, energy security blanket.
But their renewable energy strategy, putting nuclear power aside for a moment, Chandran, seems to be making massive change to the global south, who want to shift because of Paris Accords and so on, away from fossil fuels. And given that Trump is now completely abandoned any environmental policy, I get the sense that China is stepping into that breach and providing very cost-effective alternatives, whether it's solar, whether it is wind power, and even small nuclear power plants as well, and so on. So I agree that self-sufficiency is important, but I get the impression that China is actually using its energy prowess in alternative sources as a measure of its extension of its influence, part of its soft power. Do you see that in Southeast Asia, in other parts of Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa as a policy?
Absolutely, it's doing that. I mean, it has to be cautious a bit because of its might. It can suffocate local innovation in those same industries, which you do need. But it is doing that, and it's not just in terms of the hardware, the solar panels and all of that. It's also in terms of the optimization technology, which is much digital. So you have Huawei companies like Huawei, etc who are creating incredibly powerful digital tools to enable countries in Africa, Asia, etc., to optimize these systems with digital know-how. And I'm particularly aware of Huawei's innovations in this in Africa and South Asia. So this is happening throughout. I think one of the things that this is soft power, you can call it, but it's also part of China's decoupling. So the decoupling is not simply, about the United States, and that we just decouple from them. And that decoupling is essentially was initiated by the US, but China now is switching from development framework of simply talking about economic growth to economic control, meaning control of its own destiny and therefore self-reliance. And that's being done by less reliance on foreign countries and foreign technology. I mean, we saw it with the chips and all of that. And I think there's that famous interview when the chairman of Huawei, Mr. Ren, said, we're surprised. We thought we make this, you make the chips, we don't disturb your stuff. We will buy from you. You will benefit from that, and we will do our stuff. But now you're saying that we can't even buy this stuff. We thought that was globalization. So now that you say we can't buy this, no problem. We will suffer a bit of pain, but we will go and do it ourselves. So that's the first thing. They said, hey, this is irrational, but we thought we bought into this globalization stuff, but it's no more. Okay, we understand. And then support through policy the sort of local firms domestically to be dominant locally. So when they become dominant and large, as you and I know, they become better, there's competition, etc. They scale up, they have more money for R&D, and that allows the third leg of what we're talking about to then leverage that expansion of these companies, local competition, etc., for global expansion as well. And that's where I think the soft power, particularly in terms of green technology, China is leading the world. So the first two, so this is what the dual circulation is about. The first circulation is the internal circulation. And then when you got those two right, then you have the second circulation, which is the external. But the starting point is, okay, they changed the rules. We thought WTO and all of these things work, but they don't. Okay, we'll go and do our stuff, and we have the capability to do it. And you've seen this with the chips and stuff like that. So that's really what's happening. And it's turning out, as you say, into soft power, which the rest of the world appreciates in the global majority. But my word of caution to China is that it needs to be sensitive that its expansion in this way does not suffocate the innovations and industries that need to grow in those countries as well. This is extremely important as well.
Chandran, you brought a word of caution on how China should behave in this area. Another recurring, repeating, and repetitive comment these days across the global South, global majority, the other 6.5 billion, is that, hey, you're now the second largest economy, by some counts, the largest economy. You are a global power. Don't you have to move beyond your alignment of political expediency and have a greater role in suffering of the smaller nations in conflicts, not as an interventionist, but as somebody who, has this weight to influence, whether it's in Middle East at the moment, the tragedy there, Or if you extend it, I mean, you look at the developments in Caribbean Sea and shooting a Venezuelan ship. China is very exposed in Latin America as well, from Chancay port in Peru, in Venezuela, and all of that. How far can China have this Tai Chi mode and, the composure? When will China have to exert some muscle to stop some of these atrocities and hardships and human tragedies, or to be a bit more vocal in protecting its own interest? Where do you see that going? Can you elaborate on that, please?
I'm glad you used the word Tai Chi because the Tai Chi to most people is just, hey, these guys just doing slow motion moving and pretending to do
Far
some
from it.
ballet. But as you know, Tai Chi is control. It's all about control, mind and body. And I think on this front, the Chinese are doing Tai Chi, which is often referred to, reference to in a derogatory way, but Tai Chi in the positive way. And I know you didn't mean it in a derogatory term, in a way, but I've thought about this a fair bit. I've had discussions with many Chinese, but if you look at Gaza, and as you know, we had a Palestinian analyst on our webinar last week when we discussed China's global role, and he asserted that argued that this is the moment for China to step up. The Chinese, who were on the panels and the two other panels, said there's actually no space. And an Italian friend of mine commented and said, China is playing the wise man's game, not getting involved when actually there is no space. So if you look at Gaza, and of course, I'm also you share the sort of analysis you probably, why don't they do something? But I'm also thinking, what can they do? The only thing that is required in here can happen is we used to have a counterweight. It's called during the Cold War, or even recently, if you look at Syria, etc., where we had the Russians say, "You can't do that. Beware, we will be there." But Russia had a long sort of military engagement with all of these countries. But China doesn't have any military engagement. And to move away from that philosophy would cause a lot of anxiety in different parts of the world and could exacerbate tensions with the West because it would give the West the ammunition to say, "Hey, look, because right now no one can accuse China of military intervention. It's not a dropped a bomb in any country for 70 years." So I agree with you. I would like to see China, particularly with regard to Gaza, take a more uh, some sort of role that would help shape that end that tragedy. When I think about it carefully, and I can't pretend to be a geopolitical analyst, and one should actually not never try and be one, but think rationally. I can't see what it can do because the only thing that it can do is get involved in a military sense to stop Israel, America, and its European allies. It has tried everything. It has tried everything in the UN. I'll tell you say one more thing. The Chinese fundamentally believe that the UN is the way. It recognizes that the UN is weak, but it itself doesn't want to do anything that is a departure from the UN, fail, and thereby further weaken the international order. So the thinking is we stand with the UN and we have to go. And all the Chinese speakers that we had, without an exception, said UN, UN, UN. So
Chandran, I
they're
wanna
saying we need
jump
no
in
one.
there. I want to jump in there and stop you for one reason. One is that I'm not talking about military intervention. Far
I
from it.
know.
I mean, they only have Djibouti as a military base outside, comparing to 849 of the other American bases. I'm talking about humanitarian intervention. I'm talking about when the American pier was washed away at the cost of $280 million in Gaza, that they built and washed away, and they spent another 30 million to repair it. there's an opportunity for China on humanitarian level, and not only in Gaza or for that matter in Middle East, there is a growing expectation around the world. And when you talk about UN, I think you touched on it, that UN is primed and ovulating for change from Security Council to the rest of it. UN as well, in my opinion, should move to Singapore or to somewhere else. I mean, being in New York today is
It's
as
a
an
disaster.
it's a disaster. I mean, the
Yeah,
United
it's a
States is
disaster.
behaving like a bouncer at a nightclub. You know, who can come in and who cannot. I don't
Yes,
like your dress
yes,
code. I mean, you're not cool enough. So I am talking about more of humanitarian
yes,
clout.
yeah.
You know, it's
I
not
I
just
know.
about warships.
Yeah, no, I know what you meant. In that particular instance, in Gaza, any Chinese attempt to provide humanitarian aid outside the UN system would be difficult for China. Unilateral would be seen as by the United States and Israel as a provocation. I would also say that I agree with you. I think the Chinese, in my view, want to maintain a good relationship with the United States. They don't want to burn bridges, and they don't want to start something that would essentially create worsen the situation. So you're right in saying they could have done more, and I think they could. But my view is they are wedded so much to the principles of the UN. But let me also be said, leaving aside the tragedy in Gaza for a minute, but it's not known because we are all fed the global media sort of, anti-China propaganda that around the world, where there are humanitarian crises, particularly earthquakes, floods, and other things, China is one of the first to deploy its resources. But I'd agree with you that I would like to see China do more. But I can't speak to the calculations in terms of their fundamental view that the world order requires us to behave within the bounds of what exists today rather than breach it. So that's the best I can do in trying to respond to you, Ali. But like you, I would like to see them take a bolder stance.
And isn't that what the West capitalizes on then, Chandran? That they see China as moribund in a sense that they all behave beyond the United Nations Charter and actually routinely get away with it, as Ali suggests. And yet the Chinese have bound themselves. Rightly, I'm not saying that they should become mavericks like some others, but that actually inhibits China's ability to respond. For example, taking natural disasters aside, putting that aside, the Sudan, we say nothing about the tragedy of the total destruction of that country by evil forces, for want of a better term. And China, as you know, has had very strong interests in Sudan in the past, continues to do, given that Djibouti is just next door, given the importance of the Red Sea for Chinese transport and so on. And yet I see very little Chinese presence in try and moderate there. You hear sometimes Americans blabbing about it. You hear sometimes Europeans talking about it. You know about other Arab countries interfering. But China, which has had an interest in that part of in South Africa, doesn't appear to be saying anything instrumental that beyond rhetoric, Chandran, where is this great powers influence felt?
No, I agree with you. I think one of the things that one of the Chinese professors on our forum said that the way Chinese think and Chinese foreign policy is formulated is not properly understood by the rest of the world because it is in Chinese philosophy and the Chinese language. So I, for one, will not try and decode the deep thinking that goes on. But what I can say is, I think the Chinese, because of their own struggles, I mean, their support, as I was in Africa during the 80s, during the liberation wars. And Nelson Mandela famously said, when questioned by Americans in the US about why he maintains cordial relationships with the Chinese, the Russians, and the Cubans, he said, when we wanted help, you were not there, but the Cubans, the Chinese, and Russians were there. So I think the Chinese have this view that we have to help. In terms of where they are now, the ascendancy, and as you say, they're a global power. My view is they're still trying to work out how to do this because in 35 years they've suddenly become this and they're trying to work it out. They're trying to work it out in a background in which the superpower is saying, you're my enemy, you're a threat to the world, and their ally, the Europeans, the oil powers, are saying, you're a threat to the world. And so I can only imagine if I was a Chinese policy maker thinking, how am I going to react if I enter this thing in this complicated situation in Sudan? How do I do this? I will say, and with all due respect to my Chinese friends, I don't think they are very good at communication. And
Yeah.
I've said this to my Chinese brothers and sisters too. You need to communicate, but it's not the Chinese game to play propaganda internationally. They only say when we're going to act and they don't explain fully. So I think we are in a situation where many of us would like to see China play the more balancing act. But as the Chinese professor and an advisor to the I think he's a leading academic in the Xi Institute, said, we don't use the word balance either in our foreign policy. It is supporting what exists today and all of that. So it's a complicated situation where, non-experts like me can only assume that we don't fully understand. They're trying to navigate this. Hey, here we've arrived. We don't know. We've never been, the rulers of the world for the last 300 years. We don't have the arrogance. And then we have this backdrop of the Americans and the Europeans saying, you're evil. What do we do? And I think the fear is that they be led into something very confrontational and drawn into wars. And I think this is the paranoia. We don't want to be drawn into a war.
Chandran, that really weaves nicely to my next question for you. And it would be remiss of me and Anush not to pick your brains on Taiwan and on the fact that as we move forward, the technology gap is narrowing. China has now said to many, we don't want NVIDIA imports because we may have, backdoors, etc., and we cannot be at the mercy of US sanctioning, banning, etc. When the moment comes that China breaks through, which I personally, I'm not a technologist, but I think within the next 12 to 18 months, we will see a massive narrowing of the gap, similar to BYD and EVs and the semiconductors and chips. And China crosses that bridge technologically on semiconductors. Will Taiwan become only a real estate and pride issue? And given the deteriorating share and reducing share in a positive way for China of exports to the United States, as you rightly said, that it's maybe in single digits, what is the relevance of the United States in a China that has mastered the renewables, expanded its trade with Global South, and finalized that last link of semiconductors and chips? Will that still keep China as, apprehensive, or is that the last moment? And I also love your idea and some of your comments in the past that you say it's so funny that Asia Pacific always thinks or needs, or ASEAN, that they need somebody to come from Stockholm or Finland to bring them peace with 1,000 years of civilization and dialogue. And it's a miracle, as Kishore says as well, Kishore Mahbubani, that we haven't had a war in the past 50, 60 years in that part of the world. So bring all of this together in the context of relevance of the United States, once that bridge is built to technological supremacy as well, and the issue of Taiwan. How badly can US play that card to disrupt China's rise?
I think in terms of Taiwan, I've said this many times, most people do not understand that China will not attack uh, Taiwan. As a Chinese good friend of mine said to me, we Chinese will not kill other Chinese. We are not interested, right? So I think there's been a lot of provocation, which if it was the tables were turned,
Yep.
the Americans would have gone to war. But the Chinese will not go to war on this. So, and I don't think the Chinese want to see Taiwan become some, leftover little place of the post-colonial era. I think China's want to see Chinese to see Taiwan prosper, just like they want to see Hong Kong prosper. And China has gone out of its way, despite all the provocations and sanctions, etc., against Hong Kong to make sure Hong Kong survives. And today, Hong Kong, if you've read the FT the last couple of weeks, for the first time in about 5, 6 years, very positive stories about Hong Kong. But it's more on the financial side. I think we still got a lot to fix on the social side because of the disparities. So, what's the relevance of the United States? I don't care actually, to put it bluntly, because I think we all want to see the United States as well be successful. But as someone who was born in Malaysia and was politicized, but what I thankfully want to think I appreciated at an early age was essentially war crimes being committed. I'm very happy to see the United States leave our region because what are they doing here? Imagine a Chinese presence of tens and scores of military bases and Secret Service hideouts throughout Latin America. It would be unthinkable. So I'd like to see the United States stay relevant, mainly to its own people, because as others have said, and Pankaj said the other day, is a low intensity civil war going on. So we give the United States too much oxygen, in my mind, with regard to its ongoing sort of relevance in the world. It should stay relevant because it's a large, powerful country. It has great institutions which are now being eroded. It has good universities, but it's not the only place that has good universities, etc. But it has because our terms of reference are still the same old Western terms of reference, right? So we like to see the United States be relevant, but not relevant in the state of being a hegemonic power. And I think we do not want to see China in this part of the world be a hegemonic power either. And I hope we do not come to a point where we say that to China, what are you doing? And as you know, I work trying to balance this out in our little contributions at the Global Institute. And part of that is making sure that there's greater understanding of the needs of the region, and China understands also what its limits should be and what it should try and do and fulfill its promise of peaceful rise and shared humanity. And that I think is important. And in the United States, because it's a very important country, wants to play and contribute to that world, but not just in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, then that would be the new relevance of the United States, not the game it's playing today, supporting a genocide, supporting Zionists and then white supremacy all over the world. But I can't shift that. The American people need to shift that. And this week I was speaking to a couple of young Americans who said, we are protesting. But I said, most of your protests is what I call the Hello Kitty version. You know, you want to know real protests? Well, go to Nepal, go to Indonesia. People really say this is enough and send a signal. But you guys are still in your Starbucks and cafe lattes, and as soon as the 20 minutes of protest is over, you're back onto your devices. And I'm being slightly flippant here, but the change in the United States will need to come from its people. And at the moment, it's difficult to see how that will not be something that is kind of violent. But for the United States to stay relevant, it will need to somehow, from somewhere, a very, very good leader needs to emerge. And that leader needs to understand one thing. We live in a multipolar world. Uncle Sam ain't number one, but no one's looking for Uncle Sam to disappear. We need Uncle Sam, but Uncle Sam needs to play with everybody else and not maintain this exceptionalism. And I think that is the bane of the American problem. The idea that we are exceptional and not at all acknowledge its historic, its history and the age we live in. So it needs to stay relevant, but we also need China to be contributing, but not replicate. And one of the things the Chinese are very aware of is not to make the same mistakes as the United States. And this comes back to my point. They don't know yet how this game plays out. And that explains partially why, some of us are frustrated by why don't they do something about this? So that's really how I see things playing out in the region. And last point I'll make is I think many in the region, coming back to where we started, look at the US president and look at the Chinese and say, my God, there's a world of difference here. Someone's speaking trash, and this other person is giving us thought leadership and wisdom. Now we need to follow that. And they are all working very hard to make sure that China becomes a responsible partner in our development as we become partners in their development. And then rounding this up, this is where China and India coming together will shape, the course of the 21st century and bringing Pakistan, Bangladesh, two large countries. They're not Mickey Mouse countries with 10 million people. They're large countries, and they cannot be left to their own devices at the moment. They will need a global assistance, and that's how I see it panning out.
Well, listen, normally we bring our session to an end with a question to our audience. What is your single most important advice to cinephobes and to the cinephiles? So, Chandran, Nair, one piece of advice for both parties. What would that be? Short and succinct, and the way you want it.
Be open-minded. We are entering a new age, and everything's going to be better if we can be open to new ways of thinking and not steeped in the old sort of old war, post-colonial era.
Thank you.
Chandran, you've definitely pointed the way to opening our minds to not just new thinking, but new ways of looking at the world in which we live and the world in which we all have a major stake in. From the amazing context you provided for the analysis, I've got three big takeaways. First one is that don't expect the world from China. China is still trying to find its feet in this rapidly shaking ground under its feet, domestically, but also internationally, that is still trying to locate itself and not make the mistakes of imperial powers as it becomes this inevitable giant in the most important corner of the planet as we go forward into this and century and beyond. Second is that for India to get over its inferiority complex and begin to recognize itself as an emerging power, not yet on par with China, but as a partner of China in trying and facilitate its own growth, but also creation of a very different global dynamics with these two giants as partners rather than as rivals that the West would like to see them as. And the third is that, and this I found worrying, that actually America is going through very dangerous domestic transformation. And America at war with itself is a really, really dangerous thing for the rest of us, as much as it is for the Americans. And that while we're obsessed about China's rise, I think we need to focus a little bit more about what is happening in America domestically and begin to think about the implications of that for America as this giant democracy as it has been, but also in the way in which America's fractured world affects the rest of us. And we couldn't have got those pearls of wisdom from anybody else but yourself, who is exposed to a world of ideas and experiences from where you sit, but in terms of the networks that Ali identified, you interact with. So we are really, really grateful to you for kicking off our new season with such a rich set of ideas and comments, analysis. Thank you, Chandran.
Thank you, Chandran, for
Listen,
joining.
Ali, thank you very much. You know, you can edit this out, but can I just say that America is already at war with itself, and its war within is affecting its foreign policy.
Right.
We need to understand that too. And I've written about this too. So the rest of the world needs to help the United States, but it's not seeking help. And we need to find partners within the United States who are willing to understand that the rest of us care about the future of the United States, but we will not be bullied anymore. And its own internal war has started, and that affects foreign policy and affects us. So every time a bomb is dropped by a US president, be sure that it's affected by jockeying for influence within the right or the left in the United States because of that internal war. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. We will not edit it. We will leave it intact. And thank you for being with us all the way from Hong Kong. Enjoy the dinner. Have some rest. We'll hope to have you soon back on BRI Dialogues.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'm humbled that you've invited me. Thank you.